right. Good morning. I hope this works. Yes, I can hear myself. That's good. Good morning, everybody, and a happy Tuesday, whatever that may be and mean to you. Hey, Ori, how you doing this morning? Perfect. Yeah, I survived the night. I'm more tired than I was yesterday, which is saying a lot, really. But we're doing this today, and I will go through some, administrative stuff in the first sprint, and then do some more writing in the second one. I also need to make a final decision what to read or listen to, which audiobook to listen to when I go to the gym, and that's a choice I will make throughout these two sprints. The choices are all weird because I'm weird. Like the stuff that I have on my phone right now are Wizard of the Pigeons by what's her name? Well, not Robin Hobb, the other one, Megan Lindholm, and then I have If on a Winter's Night a Traveler by Italo Calvino, and Lord of Light by Roger Zelazny, and The Mythologies by Roland Barthes, because I don't know, I'm that kind of person. And Ammonite by Nicola Griffith, and those are like the choices for the gym today, and I have no idea which one I'm gonna take. Hey, Britton, how are you liking the Yiddish Policemen's Union so far, Britton? I mean, I've said before that I think it's a really, really good book, but that's that's my opinion. So I'm very interested. What do you think about it so far? I finished all the Redwall stuff reading yesterday. I did not finish all the recording because I was too tired, and I decided that it's probably better if I do it today, because no one's gonna watch like 3 Redwall videos in one day anyway. So why would I even bother, right? Obviously, I feel bad for not finishing all 13 videos on the day that I said I would, but then again, breaking deadlines that I set for myself is very much my brand. So what you got to do, right? The thing is, I need to check some things in The Legend of Luke, which is the 12th book, because the audiobook is a bit weird there. And I need to find an ebook copy of that one later today before I can, do the recording. But that's a problem for me after I return from the gym, because I don't think I'll be able to get that figured out during the gym. Obviously not during the gym, but also not during sprints, I don't think. But beyond that, I am optimistic that I will get stuff done during the first one. I also need to vote in our offline book club on which book to read next, which will be interesting, because someone suggested we should all read The Worm Ouroboros, which I haven't done in a long time, and might be something that will be interesting, because I know the other people in there, and I don't know if they're happy with Edison's very specific style of pseudo-Edwardian English. But, not my problem. The other option there, I think, is The Buried Giant by Katsue Ishiguro, and obviously that one is something I've always been interested in. So maybe I'll vote for that. Yes, it is. It is very sad, but I mean, it's a noir police story, right? It's supposed to be sad. I think, Britain, that Ori is referring to the very rough paper, that paper quality that we spoke about on Sunday. So with the flipping pages, I don't know. Obviously, I don't have the printed version, so I don't know about that. I wonder if that was like a deliberate like design choice to make it feel more pulpy. Maybe, I don't know. With authors like Chabon, that is a possibility. The thing is, I have never read any Italo Calvino, but I've always wanted to. Unfortunately, it's another one of those authors where like most of like there's like one of his books is translated into German and available in audio. That's The Baron in the Trees. Um, and that only came out like sometime last year. Whereas like all of his books have been translated and available as unabridged English audiobooks forever, but they have been region locked to America, which I don't know how many Americans actually actively read Italo Calvino, but maybe. So having access to If on a Winter's Night is very, very new to me. So I'm very excited about that. And I don't feel like starting my Elric journey quite yet. So I figured something short and weird might just do the trick, because it's a way to sort of bridge the time until Death of the Author comes out next week. Or maybe I'll go with Wizard of the Pigeons, which I've wanted to read for a long time as well. It shows up like it gets like a long, almost in a whole chapter to itself in Farah Mendelssohn's Rhetorics of Fantasy. So I guess I'm already very much spoiled for everything that happens in that book. But after having read like a long essay on how good it is and why it works so well as a specific form of liminal fantasy, using Mendelssohn's specific terminology here, I feel duty bound to read it. Also, it's one of those really sad things because it's also region locked. And like 2 years ago, I don't know, Liam from Liam's Lyceum sent me that audiobook as a gift through Audible, which works because you can send a book that is available to you on Audible as a gift to someone else. And if they are not in the same region, then Audible automatically transfers that book into just an Audible credit. So I feel even more duty bound to, now that I can actually get the book, to finally read it. Because yeah, of course. And I am very much excited about this specific approach of, fantasy or not fantasy, or whatever you want to call it. I mean, of course, all of Chabon's books get pretty sad at some points. It's, him being a generally good and very skilled writer, and that means you kind of touch on all kinds of parts of life, right? I also read his book Moonglow, and that one is really sad. It's really interesting. It's sort of like, I guess, semi-autobiographical. I don't know how much of this is actively based on his personal experiences and how much is sort of like his fictionalized self inserted there. But it's basically about him sitting up with his dying grandfather, and his grandfather telling him all kinds of stories about his time in World War II and all of these things, which obviously become highly unbelievable in some parts, but his father's also grandfather, I think is also heavily on on painkillers and stuff. So it's always, so the question is like, how much of this is like sort of like his true memories, how much of this is just like hallucinations and so forth. And it's it's a very sad book in that regard, but it's also really funny in some bits. Also, to be fair, calling any book that tries for like that very specific noir, hard-boiled style overwritten, I think, is missing the point, because all of these books use a very specific, kind of style that is overwritten, so to speak, by definitions. Like, it feels wrong, right? If you claim that stuff is overwritten. But then again, I've never understood the criticism of a book being overwritten. I guess like the closest I can come to that is the first trilogy of like the Thomas Covenant books, because they feel like Stephen Donaldson might not be fully in control of the pseudo Tolkienian language that he uses. I guess that's how I would phrase that. But beyond that, is like calling a book overwritten is more you not knowing the words and being annoyed by having to look up words. Exactly. It doesn't feel overwritten because it has all the things I expect from this specific style of book, including some weird metaphors and a lot of self pity in the main character. That stuff has to be in there. That's the book I was promised. So having it written in, say, a mistborn vocabulary with the same level of sort of like introspection would totally fail. But yeah, maybe that's partly the problem, is that the idea that certain genres have certain conventions when it comes to style and language used is something that some people miss. I don't know. I don't know who has complained about it being overwritten, but then what do I know? Does it have a glossary? I don't know, because the audiobook certainly doesn't. But that's once again, the audio book being, not having not all the pages of the printed book. What the audiobook, however, does have is an interview with Michael Chabon about the book, which nice as well, where he talks about how he came up with the idea of the Yiddish Policemen's Union. So that was neat. Um, but yeah, of course, colorful metaphors. I mean, it's the same thing. Like if you played back in the early 2000s, was it like 2002 or whenever that came out? If you ever played like Max Payne, or the first Max Payne video game, right? That book, that game also has like that very over the top sort of like metaphoric language in a lot of ways, like in the narration. I mean, and it is funny in that it kind of pokes fun at that specific style, but that only works if you have an established style you can over exaggerate in an ironic way, because otherwise people won't notice the joke in there. So I think, yeah, Yiddish Policemen's Union does walk that line in some way. But that's always what you do when you write genre fiction in one specific mode, is that you always walk that line between hitting it completely right and maybe going too hard and collapsing it into irony, I think. I mean, that is what, if you set out deliberately to write a specific genre, right? If you just add dragons, it's not necessarily writing epic fantasy. But if you write like Tolkien, or you like if you want to write a Tolkien-esque kind of fantasy, you have certain conventions to adhere to and maybe get them exactly right or slightly overdo them. And I think the first Thomas Covenant book sometimes overdoes the language, but that's maybe just a me thing. I just always felt it. To me, the first Stephen Donaldson book, the first Thomas Covenant book, reads like an American trying real hard to sound British and failing because he's American. Oh, okay. I have not read A Memory Called Empire yet. Is that something I should change? The title has always interested me, but it's always been praised by people who usually read very, very different things from, or enjoy very different things from, the stuff that I usually enjoy. So I've kind of stayed away from it. See, what's interesting there is that in that interview, at the end of the audiobook, Michael Chabon talks about how he picked up a Yiddish phrase book, a specific Yiddish phrase book, and somewhere in a secondhand bookstore, and was so in love with that that's sort of like how the idea about for Yiddish Policemen's Union kind of came to be. And he mentions the authors of that specific Yiddish phrase book and everything. It's like, why make your own Yiddish glossary at the end and not just go like, hey, here's the book that I use. Why don't you just get the same Yiddish phrase book if you want to learn more Yiddish? The thing is, Britain, by the end of the book, you'll notice that all the backstory of Landsman's family is also important, and is because it's that kind of noir kind of story where all the darkness that the detective has in his past will always come back to haunt them in some way or form as well. So that is deliberate. What I personally really appreciated is how Jewish in a lot of ways, or uniquely Jewish, the whole um, the Sitka city in a lot of ways feels, right. The street names and all of these things. It does feel very old worldy, European Jewish in a way that obviously was destroyed in Europe by the Nazis in a lot of ways. Um, he captures that feeling really well. It's probably the one thing where I kind of disagree with Abigail Nussbaum's criticism that he didn't like actually translate it too much into like contemporary. Like it felt sort of like old timey. I think that was deliberate because so much of the book is about being stuck in sort of like this weird state in the past, sort of in a lot of ways. So I felt that was somewhat deliberate, but we all have different opinions about books, and I'm an outsider, so I wouldn't know. But like I really enjoyed the book. I think it does some really interesting things, in particular when it gets closer to the end. So I'm not going to spoil that now, but it does some really cool things when it comes to the larger crime stuff going on. The problem usually is, Britain, that people like to when people for whatever reason don't vibe with a book, we need to come up with reasons why a book doesn't work for us, which understandable. That's how criticism works, right? We read a book, we don't feel it, we come up with like phrases or like we come up with explanations why that is the case. The problem, I think, is sometimes that it is easy to turn these explanations into blaming the book, when sometimes that's just not the case. And calling something overwritten is one way of doing that. The same way people use the term, purple prose in a lot of ways. Like, do you really know what those things mean? And aren't you kind of misusing them in situations where you just felt that the vocabulary was maybe too large? You're like, hey, this is purple prose. Like, no, it's not. It's not necessarily purple prose. It's just like a very specific vocabulary that is outside of your specific vocabulary, right? The first time I read the Malazan Book of the Fallen, I had to look up a lot of like geological and geographical terminology because I'm not that kind of geographer, and I'm not an archaeologist, so I don't know about rocks that much. So it's that's not purple prose. That's just like specialized vocabulary. Same way I've learned a lot about different rodents by reading Redwall. Redwall certainly. I mean, I guess there's people out there who would call Redwall using purple prose or overwritten. For me, like the main thing was that I know all of these different rodents in German, and I know all the names for like the different plants in German, but both botany and zoology are like those specialized fields where when I read the word vole in English, I'm like, well, it's one of those random rodents. And until it specifically matters what kind of rodent it is, I don't look up the actual connection and just go like small furry thing. Same way for trees. It's like I don't need to know what a beech is versus what well, an oak, I guess, is like the example, the bad example. Like I don't need to know which specific tree is which. If I go like, well, this is a tree with needles, this is a tree with leaves. That's all I need for reading these text in English. But books like Redwall and Lord of the Rings, in a way, are the kind of books where I have to look that stuff up, because suddenly the difference between a vole and a shrew and a dormouse and a field mouse and and so forth matters, because those are different groups in these books. And suddenly I have to look up the actual connections. So now I know way more about small furry animal vocabulary than I did before. Does that make it overwritten? No, it just means that I wasn't a furry animal expert before reading Redwall, and now I'm more educated through children's books, which is really cool. Yeah, it certainly goes some interesting places, but the whole thing, I like. Michael Chabon is just really good at writing very compelling characters. Like, his characters always feel very real, in that they're all somewhat somewhat of a mess, but he's really I, I said he's really humane about writing about characters in a lot of ways. Like, his characters feel real, but you can tell that if his characters go through shit, Michael Chabon feels bad for putting them through shit. He has to do that because that's his job, but he feels bad for that. And that kind of makes it, I think, easier for me to read some of his characters and like, hey, I guess the person who came up with that character really liked that character in a lot of ways. And I think that helps. Michael Chabon does have that in that sort of like humanity, I think, in a lot of ways, in all of his books, and definitely also in Cavalier and Clay and Gentleman of the Roads, which, Gentleman of the Roads is just such a good short story, I guess. I mean, it's not a short story, it's a novella, or whatever you want to call it, but it manages to take the thing that was really good about Fafhrd and Grey Mouser and then turn it into something very unique in its own rights. Plus, it has an elephant, which is, cool. All right, shall we slowly proceed to the part where I vote on books and call it productivity, and you guys do some productive reading about crimes in Sitka, and maybe you'll find out more about chess than you wanted to know before that, um, or possibly about other things, depending on where you are in that book. It is 25. So I'll be back at 10 past, what's that? 9 for me, and 10 for Ori, and something, something midnight ish for Britain, I assume. And I am back. I did indeed do stuff. I hope so did you. Oh, right. You are reading Hokolua Road. I still want to read that because I feel like Elizabeth Hand is one of those writers who has an incredible sense of place, and I'm pretty sure she can do something interesting with Hawaii as a setting. I also can see her being, say, how did we say that? Like sensitive enough to be aware of all the sort of like colonial, post-colonial, and imperialist sort of like edges that and layers that like anything set in Hawaii has, which is always interesting to me. If a writer writes about a place that they are not from, it's one of the like few things that I had like a bit of an issue with, or not like an issue with, like, but that open question with Cahokia Jazz, like, is a British professor of literature the right person to write about Native American culture in that specific way? But I mean, I feel Spuffer did like solve that admirably well. But it's something that always comes up with those kind of writers. The same thing with like Ian MacDonald writing all of his books, basically not all of his books, but a lot of his books in you know places like India, Brazil, Turkey, um, parts of Africa, Kenya, in the Kirinya, and what's it called? Evolution Short, Chaga. Chaga. I always confuse them because the audiobook that I have has the American title, which is Evolution Shore, but everyone knows it as Chaga, and I always confuse those two. But E. MacDonald does the same thing, so I'm constantly wondering, is like, are they getting how much are they getting it right? Is there a getting it right in any case, like, or is it more like about like being respectful about the place that you're writing about, especially if it has certain, if there are sort of historical problems there? Obviously, with E. MacDonald being very Irish in a lot of ways, or Northern Irish, I guess, or identifying mostly as Northern Irish at this point. He can always, I mean, he talks about like colonialism and living under a colonial rule in Northern Ireland, and how that has like shaped Irish history, which I agree with. Does give him like insights there on, and that whole like dealing with colonialism does come up in like most of his books in one way or another. So um, I can see how he can do some of these things, but there's still like ways of being culturally insensitive that I also wouldn't be able to spot because I'm also not from there. And I was wondering when I read the whole Hokulua Road thing, because it seemed to sort of lead into that, right? Because it's about like rich people's houses in Hawaii, which is a big problem there, as far as I'm aware. So that sounds like something, as I said, I'm still going to go there. I just, it's always a matter of time, and too many books and too little time. Decollage, I that's the first time I've heard that, but then again, I'm pretty sure they have like a different name in German that I would recognize. Once again, like specialized vocabulary, right? The Mountain and the Sea. I haven't read that one. And yep, I mean, I guess setting it on a sort of fake part of Hawaii is probably the best way of going about this. Yeah, yeah, Ryman definitely as well. I think I feel the not the problem, but like the good thing is that I feel with all three of these authors, I feel they did a good job. They do a good job. And the sad part is, of course, that you kind of need, unfortunately, you need white authors writing stories set in these places before public, like mainstream publishers, and those were still like in the days when self-publishing was a bit, less prevalent. It's like you need to show that you can sell these kind of books before publishers are willing to actually, publish authors from, non-white authors to begin with. And I think that's unfortunately, partly, how capitalism and white supremacy often interact in all kinds of ways. So I see why that happens in a lot of ways, and I've not seen many people complain too much about MacDonald or Ryman. I No, I don't think I've seen much criticism of Bajigalupi's portrayal of Thailand. I've seen criticism of the Wind Up Girl, but I've also not paid too much attention to it because at the time when I first read The Wind Up Girl, I wasn't online that much, so it mostly passed me by. And that when I reread it, I didn't do much research because I just reread the book out of interest. I haven't read that one, the China Mount one. Interestingly enough, Robert Evans of Behind the Bastards did recommend The Water Knife by Paolo Bajigalupi in his recent Behind the Bastards Q&A as a book to read, which made me very happy because he might just be the first person recommending that book outside of me constantly saying that everyone should read it. I guess I should just make an actual video about it at some point because it is a really good book and it kind of fell by the wayside, which is sad because, it's probably much closer to becoming reality than The Wind Up Girl did. But yeah, I was just interesting having that specific book being recommended in that context. But once again, I guess it kind of makes sense because, it is a very political and environmentally aware sort of novel in that regard. See, the thing is, with Generation Lost, I just wouldn't know because I don't know islands in Maine to begin with, so it doesn't matter for me. But I guess that's exactly the point, right? It's like people that know more about these specific places can't trip you up with details that you get wrong, and everyone else doesn't care. It's like I don't know I don't know much about Hawaii, so I would not probably figure out that this is an invented island, not an actual one. What would there being lots of islands? Who knows? Same with Maine. I mean, I guess it's sort of like geographically the same thing that a lot of the same thing that Robert E. Howard did with his Hyborian Age, where it's like, well, I want to write historical fiction, but I don't want to get up, tripped up by history nerds complaining about the wrong style of armor. So I'll just call my country Zingara and not Spain, and you'll have to deal with the fact that it's all made up and you can't complain about me. So I guess it does the same thing for geography and obviously history and geography always being intertwined, also partly to history, the same way that setting it in an invented country allows you to do historical fiction without having to adhere too closely to historical facts. I think if depending on what you write in fantasy, it's very difficult to not have colonialism as one of the main topics or one of these themes be in there. I mean, unless you just focus on one specific place with no outside influence. It's as soon as you have larger empires or anything of the sort, you will have to reckon with some form of colonialism because that's something that happens all the time. The question is what you do with that and how much of a key theme you make it. But I personally think in a lot of ways it is just one of the things that us as Western societies are still slowly coming to terms with, or not, depending on where you stand politically. So it makes sense that it is one of the main things that we are currently dealing with in fantasy literature as well, right? The same way that, say, a lot of fantasy and science fiction in the 50s dealt with the aftermath of war, arguably, Lord of the Rings, and a lot of these dealt with that because having just come through 2 world wars and all of that stuff was a bit on people's minds at the time. Whereas, colonialism and dismantling colonialism is something that, even after even after the empire the British Empire kind of got smaller and all of that, it still took a while for people to realize that there are other forms of colonialism that's like, the economic imperialism, all that stuff, right? It, I mean, when did Orientalism, as one of those like sort of big texts, was that 77, 78, something like that, right? This is not yet long in the past, so it is just slowly trickling into pop culture and culture over the last maybe 10 years or so. In a lot of ways, 20 years is sort of like when this appears in the broader culture in a lot of ways. So I may not enjoy all fantasy or science fiction treatments of colonialism at the moment, but that's just something I'll have to live with, the same way I would have probably been annoyed by a lot of stuff coming out in the 50s or 60s if I had been reading then. Ruritania, yeah, yeah. I mean, I won't comment on Reads with Rachel. I've enjoyed some of her videos. I have a lot of gripes with some of her other videos. It's BookTube. People do what they do, and it's clearly working for her. Um, and I'll leave it at that. Uh, um, but yeah, I don't know. Like the thing that I'm writing on, speaking about something that will happen in a couple of minutes. I don't know how much colonialism will play into that, because I am very much sort of like focusing on like a local region. I want to look at something that I think is so difficult to explain. Um, is bringing out something that I feel is a very specific sort of character or atmosphere or whatever that some parts of like Germany have in a lot of ways, like pre-Nazi Germany has in a lot of ways, like because there is something very specific about like if go to the larger parts of forests that we still have, like the sort of like mountain ranges and all of that, and there is a very specific sort of feeling with those places. And you have the same if you go, it's not Germany as as a nation state. It's more like the area between like where I live all the way to, parts of Bohemia, parts of Poland, parts of, Czech Republic or Slovakia, that has a very specific sort of atmosphere and feel that is very different from your medieval fantasy that is more French or English inspired. And I don't see that much writing sort of tapping into that, which is, I think, unfortunate. I mean, technically, I guess The Witcher does so in some ways. I have my own problems with The Witcher that, I'm not going into that right now, but I I see sort of like there is something there that I think is worth exploring or putting into writing, because it is different it is different, and yet something that I can sort of speak about or speak of relatively confidently, because again, I'm living here. So that's something I'm trying for. I don't know if I'll succeed, because obviously that's always a very different question. But that's sort of like where I'm trying to go with this, which is, you know, we all need hobbies, I guess. Well, I mean, you basically just have to look at the Hugo nominees and winners, because those are, I think, probably the best sort of mirror of the zeitgeist in the more involved part of science fiction writing and fandom. And after that, I would go just look at what Bookborn is complaining about. That will that will tell you what is currently a hot topic in science fiction and fantasy. But yeah, of course, it's colonialism and imperialism, and it's gender identity and gender issues, which, you know, it's kind of sad that gender, colonialism, and racism are still the main things that we need to deal with. I feel we're getting slowly back into actively criticizing capitalism, which I think is obviously, once again, something that will be even more now, what with, the new US regime and everything. So I'm hoping for some more rabidly anti-capitalist fantasy and science fiction coming out in the next couple of years. But that's, that's like one of those things with art, right? Art is always going to be about what is currently happening, and politically problematic times usually often lead to very interesting art. I think what's his name? Al Jurgensen from Ministry, the industrial band, once said that he can only write good albums when there's Republican presidents because otherwise he's not angry enough to to make good art. I wouldn't go that far, but I think it certainly can be a driver there. I have not read that yet, but it might be interesting. I mean, there's also is it Spinning Silver by Naomi Novik. I haven't read that yet, so maybe that's something I should probably also read if I'm interested in that. And I I think like the interesting part about this specific sort of like German, vaguely the western part of Central Europe. I think what makes it so interesting is that from the outside, everyone thinks like Germany. They're all blonde people that used to believe in Thor and Odin, and now they're Christians or whatever. And then they turn Nazi, and that is very much sort of like underestimating exactly like the Slavic influence in a lot of like culture around here, and the some like some vague Celtic influences if you go far enough back, but like the Slavic influences are very very important here and often get sort of like lost. So yeah, that that's something I'm looking into because I think it's interesting and it's worth exploring. And yeah, we all try to do dumb things from time to time. Speaking of dumb things, shall we actually try to do that? By which I mean I'll try to do some dumb writing and you can do some more dumb reading or possibly intelligent reading. I assume that all your books are interesting. I mean, Hokalua Road sounds interesting, and I know that Yiddish Policeman's Union is interesting, so I guess we're good. And that allows me to drink more tea and, yeah, talk about peasant uprisings and the Bunchu. And I am back. Hey, Chantel. I don't know if there's anything specific. Like, technically, the idea here is that we are doing two 45-minute sprints in the morning while, after I wake up and drink tea for breakfast. And then we talk a bit about books and stuff around that. Unfortunately, I often get sidetracked for all kinds of noble and ignoble reasons. And then the idea of doing 15 minutes talking, 45 minutes sprints, 15 minutes talking, and so forth gets somewhat messy, and we end up talking for like half an hour about stuff. So that's like the only thing you need to know. Also, I'm really bad at using timers and shit. So yeah, these are still very, very raw in that regard. But if you have time in the morning, I'll be doing these every weekday from 8 a.m. My time, which is GMT +1 for like roughly 2 hours, I guess, in that regard. And I did manage to do some writing, not nearly enough, but that is the just how it is these days. Because I had to reply to some messages and do some stuff that was sort of like urgent, and so that's what I did. But I also wrote a bit more, and now I need to decide where to actually end the chapter, because I could end it here, or I could maybe add some more bits and pieces that I could, that might be sort of relevant, or I can push them into like the next chapter. I'm just not sure. Maybe I'll just keep, maybe I can, just write it now as part of this chapter. And if I feel it's too much, then I can either push it to the next or do something else with it. I mean, that's always an option, right? Or I'll just have to think about it while I'm at the gym, and maybe I'll come up with a brilliant solution. Speaking of, I just found out that Michel Foucault's Discipline and Punish is, in fact, currently free on Audible for me. So I guess I have, like, well, I mean, I am going to the gym, right? It seems like the appropriate kind of title. Although, of course, I know it's about the prison system. So, yeah. Oof, that is quite the challenge, Harry Potter. I have never read Harry Potter because, I mean, I started the first book, I think, when my sister got into it, but I was slightly too old at the time, so I wasn't interested in it. Or just too immaturely pretend old to read it. And that means I have never read them. I don't think they would work well for me now, though. That's certainly what, I worry there, I guess. Yeah, the thing with the timer is I would need to figure out how to put that in there, and it's always a bit of an accessibility issue. I am blind, which is something I don't necessarily always advertise, but using these kind of things like a timer can sometimes be somewhat difficult to square with like the screen reader stuff. So I need to find like a good way of doing that, and if I can come up with one, I will do that. Maybe I'll just try to find like a 45-minute like physical egg timer might be a really fun idea to have that, something like that, and use that. I am, this is an experiment, like so much in life. Well, I hope that your experience rereading Harry Potter is going well so far, because I mean, I feel I would probably get mad constantly at the book, because from all I've heard from like friends that I've read it and so forth, it's like it doesn't look like the kind of book that I could just leave alone and enjoy the whimsy or whatever that is in there. I would probably get mad at it a lot, and I think there's worthier targets for my anger than this one. But yeah, I certainly need to figure out what I'm actually going to read or listen to while I'm at the gym now, because Foucault might just be a bit too hard, although the title just, makes for a good joke, I guess. Might go with something less challenging, which is also like why I'm not sure I can go with the Italo Calvino if on a winter's night a traveler, because that might also be a bit too challenging and you know require focus. But speaking of the gym, I would probably have to be somewhat speedy about packing my stuff so I can catch a bus, which is the goal here. So I thank everyone for actually coming in. I'm sorry this is basically the end of it for you, Chantel, but maybe I'll see you tomorrow on this, or Wednesday. Well, tomorrow's Wednesday, right? Or Thursday or Friday. And yeah, certainly be very welcome here. Yeah, I can see that. Like, of course, there's a need for like a suspension of disbelief in a lot of ways. I just also feel like they are very sort of like 1990s in a lot of ways, which makes like suspending disbelief much harder if you've lived through a specific time. Like, I can suspend my disbelief for something set in like a medieval setting or like an ancient history setting or whatever, much more than something where I'm like, I remember being there. Maybe that's like another problem, that we'll have to wait like 100 or 200 years before we can enjoy books set in the 90s again. You have a nice day as well, Ori. And yeah, I'll record my last two Redwall videos later today, and then we're finally done with this one, and I can move on to something less fun, I guess, because that's usually how these things go. All right. See you guys around tomorrow.